Hello and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
And today we have another really special episode where we have another guest, and this time another published author. Welcome to Robert B. O'Connor.
Thank you so much, John. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we're very pleased, very pleased. So, Ian, you normally take the next.
Yeah,
question.
so we were wondering, Robert, if you could just give a brief introduction to yourself, what your drivers were in writing this book, what your life experiences were that drove this book, because it's obviously name the book as well, which we'll come on to later. We're going to go through the book.
I always forget that, don't I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I won't allow that. I won't allow that.
Go for it then. The stage is yours, Robert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
2 minutes or however long.
About 15 years or so ago, I went through a hard patch in my life. I think everybody does if you live long enough. And I became intensely interested in the subject of morale and how we do the hard things in life and what happens when we don't and we find ourselves in a tough situation. And I started to write down my thoughts. And I found that kind of helped pull me out of the funk I was in. So I continued on that and wrote a nonfiction book called Gumption Aid, the booster for your self-improvement plan. And for your British listeners, gumption is, I think, an American archaic term for kind of a combination of intelligence and courage and high spirits. Wrote that book. And in that book, I gave a quote that had actually been on my father's desk. My father, who spent much of the war in Liverpool, by the way. But this quote had been on my father's desk. We never talked about it, but I think it had been both an encouragement for him and also perhaps a scourge. And it's by a semi-famous Englishman, Thomas Huxley, who was a famous 19th century biologist. The quote is this: "The most valuable result of all education is the ability to make yourself do the thing you have to do when it ought to be done, whether you like it or not." And, I have kept, my father had that on his desk. I have kept that in front of me. And that was kind of the basis for that first book I wrote, which was essentially a self-help book, which is, how do we do what needs to be done when it needs to be done? And it's not only the motivation of doing something, it's the figuring out the what, because, the world will tell us what we ought to do and what we ought to be. And that's usually not right for us. So I wrote that book and I found I had been in marketing for most of my career, did a fair amount of advertising, copywriting. And I found the process of writing that book to be very helpful for me and enjoyable in the way that, running 5 miles in cross country is enjoyable, which is it's very enjoyable when it's finished.
Yes.
And you can talk about it. I then thought I would write another nonfiction book. I started my marketing career at a soap company called Procter & Gamble and was sent within weeks to remedial memo writing school to learn how to write memos in the Procter & Gamble style. It was taught by a gentleman named Gib Carey. And we really never got on to writing. Basically, what he did is regale us with all the Procter & Gamble legends. And the number one legend at that time was called the Oxydol Circus. Gib Carey Oxydol was a famous brand of detergent up until probably the late 60s. Gib Carey was the Oxydol brand manager in 1968, and he was approached by a circus promoter named Jim Hetzer. Tanzer is the character that he becomes in my book. He was approached by Jim Hetzer, and he decided that Oxydol would sponsor this traveling circus that Jim Hetzer, the circus promoter, had. I won't go into it other than it turned out to be a disaster, humorous only in retrospect. Gib Carey managed to survive the Oxydol circus and was still at Procter & Gamble when I arrived. But I thought, oh, this is a fabulous topic to write about. I located Jim Hetzer's daughter. Jim Hetzer had died much before then. And she said, oh, yes, my father was a circus promoter and did that. But did you know that my father was an enlisted entertainer in the American Army in World War II? And that he actually was on a Jeep show squad with Mickey Rooney. And I said, not only did I not know that your father did that, I did not know there were enlisted entertainers in the United States Army. And she said, oh, yes, it was the Morale Corps. And they were assigned to many things, but for these entertainment soldiers, which is Military Occupation Specialty 442, they did two things. They put on amateur shows with soldiers in the rear echelon, kind of just to keep them busy, give them something to do. But mostly they did Jeep shows for frontline combat troops in places where the USO and the Red Cross could not go. Now, your readers or your listeners are probably familiar with ENSA, the British organization that entertained troops all over the place. There, as some of them call ENSA every night something awful. The American equivalent was actually called Special Services after 1942. In my book, Jeep Show, I call it Morale Corps just for simplicity. So going back to my conversation with this gentleman's daughter, I said, oh, and she said, by the way, his older sister, my Aunt Mabel, saved every letter he wrote home from the European theater, from training camp and from Europe, as well as letters he wrote home when he was trying and failing to make it in show business in New York in the late 30s. And I thought to myself, primary source material. Oh, my goodness. And I said, could I come down to Dallas and look through these letters? I'll put on, white cotton archival gloves and, and she said, oh, don't worry. My sister published them in a book. So I bought the book and I had 150 or so letters that Private James Hetzer wrote home to his family while he was in Europe during the war doing Jeep shows. And then in the endless internet, I stumbled upon the Army's manual for the Morale Corps and the list of the supplies they could, here's how you get the microphone you attach to the battery of your Jeep. Here's the trailer you can use if you want to bring, a set with you. And it almost reads, it is almost absurd to read in, 2025, this manual, but again, a primary source. So I knew I wanted to write about that. And sorry to
interrupt. So when you said you wanted to write about it, did you see it just as a fantastic story, or did you have an interest in entertainment or interested in the military? Or
that's a very good question. I didn't have an interest in entertainment per se. As I said, I had an interest in morale and, how we do the hard things. And certainly there's not much harder than being a frontline combat infantry soldier, especially in the Ardennes in the winter. I also think of, India in the high summer would also be terrible. So I had that interest in morale. And then I just had a basic interest in writing another book because I had found it to be a satisfying piece of work. I have a philosophy about life, which I've developed, which relates to, we all need a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And when our children are grown, what is your work? You gentlemen were engineers, what is your work? And often it's not what you get paid to do. So what I realized a few years ago is the work for me now is writing. And thus, I was looking around for something to write. I did decide to make it fiction as a challenge. Writing fiction I found to be more difficult than writing nonfiction. In nonfiction, you can just tell people what you want to tell them. In fiction, if you just tell people what you want to tell them, they get bored and they stop reading. So you have to show them with characters' actions and dialogue and all that.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because your book is got a lot of dialogue in it. I mean, no, it's
right.
I'm not saying that that's an issue, but there's a lot of dialogue. How did you make the dialogue authentic to the period? Because we don't speak, even in America, we don't speak,
right.
slightly, the people don't speak in the 2000s the way they did in 1940. So how did you ensure that it rang true?
It's a good question. One thing is I seem to have a natural ear for accents. And it may be from watching too much British TV. And then again, I lived in England for a year. So I have a natural appreciation for accents. I can always tell when somebody's from Liverpool or, somebody's from the north of England. And of course, Scotland is so easy.
Yeah.
So I had a natural appreciation.
Although people in Scotland don't believe I'm from Scotland anymore, which is most bizarre because patently I still have a Scottish accent. But
they don't think you're a Brummie, though, do they?
Well, indeed. But
they're just giving you stick.
Indeed, there's probably an element of that.
An English idiom there. So
absolutely.
I knew I wanted to make the dialogue authentic. So the first thing I did is pulled several lists of American slang of the late 30s and early 40s. And I also read several what I think are called noir detective books written in the late 30s, The Maltese Falcon being one of them, The Big Sleep being another, because they're very good books even today, and they're over the top on use of idioms and slang and dialogue. I watched several movies from the time, and so just kind of put that together. You have to be careful with slang and idioms because if it's sort of like adding pepper, hot sauce to your gumbo, or the right amount is great, but if you do it too much, the readers are spending too much time trying to figure out what that means or all that. So I tried to be judicious with it. My favorites were, though, and again, this comes back to my experience living in England, but the British characters. I loved, there's a chapter where the character is going over to England, actually landing in Scotland. As you know, that's where the troop ships landed, on the Queen Mary. I wrote that because my dad went over to England on the Queen Mary as a troop ship. And there's a short conversation between two Cunard Line crew members who are obviously from the East End of London. And I just loved, researching and putting in the slang. One of my favorites, which I'm now trying to get into my everyday conversation, is bloody banging. That was that was terrific. Bloody banging. That were. Of course, they say that were, not that was. So I had a natural interest in it. I felt it would make the book more interesting and authentic. And I had an editor to tell me when I had overdone it.
Okay. I must admit, it was one of the things when I first started reading, although I did listen to it on Audible.
Yeah.
So,
good. Thank you.
Oh, we both read it. I mean, so as John says,
But it was one of the things that when I first started reading it, I was like, this is quite. I found it drew me in. That sort of level of detail and whatever. And I say, I'm enjoying this. Because sometimes you can have a book and it's a bit dry. Yeah. But this just kept it going. And and I particularly liked right at the beginning when you're talking about the saluting and all that type of stuff, and it did make me smile a bit, So it was I enjoyed that. Yeah.
John, one of the things I found is research is fun and writing is hard. Yeah. So I did a lot of research on what life was like on the. I probably did 3 months research of the Queen Mary as a troop ship. Enjoyed it thoroughly, and then was able to use about 3% of what I learned. Interestingly, one anecdote that I borrowed in the book, the main character is shampooing his hair. They had saltwater showers on the Queen Mary. He's shampooing his hair with a special soap that works in salt water. there is a all quarters alarm and the water gets turned off and he has to go stand at his lifeboat station with a towel or with nothing but a towel, and his hair, the sun comes out and his hair hardens because he's still got all this soap in it. That story was borrowed from a British army private or corporal going somewhere in the Mediterranean on a troop ship. But I loved that story so much that I stuck it on the Queen Mary. So the research, I'm sure I over researched the book, but it turned up many incidents and anecdotes of which I could pick, just the ones I thought the readers would enjoy the most.
So you mentioned that the real historical character, I'm going to say Jim Tanzer, but that's not right. That's your character.
Right.
Jim
Sorry,
Hetzer.
I made Jim Hetzer. Yes.
Jim Hetzer. He knew Mickey Rooney. So, putting a well-known to a certain age demographic character like that, did you have any qualms about adding Mickey Rooney in, or was it an obvious thing to do? Or?
Oh, I had the opposite of qualms. First of all, it was based on historical fact.
Yeah.
Mickey Rooney did volunteer for the United States Army in 1944. He was feeling there was some public pressure of celebrities, of the age to enlist. So there was some of that, but he could have. I'm full of respect for him. He could have enlisted and served his time at Hal Roach Studios in Los Angeles, 10 minutes from his house.
Yeah.
He chose to, jump in with both feet, go all the way, join the Morale Corps and serve overseas and literally in a combat zone. I theorize, I don't have this in the book, but just between us and your listeners, Mickey Rooney was an absolute genius, and the directors he worked with said he and Charlie Chaplin were the two most talented people they'd ever worked with. And he was a hard worker on the set. Off the set, his life was a wild man. Yeah. He was married to Ava Gardner, who was the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. He cheated on her. He parties every night. He and his posse invaded the sets of other movies while they were, just absolutely out of control. And I theorize that some part of him, it may have been unconscious, was thinking, this lifestyle is going to kill me. I need to get as far away from it as I can. And so I'm going, I'm not going to go to Hal Roach Studios and stay home. I'm going to go to Europe and get in my own way. So that was based on reality. And then Mickey Rooney, as you say, is well known to American adults of what we call the boomer generation. So I thought that would also be attractive. But I just wanted to tell the story. And there he was in the middle of the story in real life.
Yeah, there's obviously there was a few people like him. I guess the famous one is James Stewart, who was a B-24 pilot, and then Clark Gable, who flew certainly almost a dozen missions as a waist gunner on B-17s, which it's hard to imagine Clark Gable standing there
right
over France and Germany. It's just bizarre, isn't it? But I think the funniest story I hear is John Wayne. John Wayne did not serve. But John Wayne apparently tried to join the OSS, which was the nascent CIA. And can you imagine parachuting somebody like John Wayne into France or Italy and anybody thinking he was anybody else other than John Wayne? It's just, but anyway, so it's an interesting arc of who tried and who didn't. I guess the people who didn't, you just don't know who, what they did. Okay, so.
There's another book idea for you, Robert. Yeah,
thank you.
You could start looking at celebrities during the Second World War.
Yeah.
I will say, John, I'm kind of sick of the Second World War. Researching it did make me feel closer to my dad, which was nice. But I'm thinking about Korea and the Korean War and somehow involving this character in the Korean War, which would be a much more fictional stretch than Jeep Show.
Yeah. So going back to Jeep Show, which by the way is the name of the book. The core of the book, arguably, you can correct me if I'm wrong. The core of the book is set in what is colloquially known as the Battle of the Bulge. So the German attack on on the Ardennes. Was Jim Hetzer actually there, or was that a stretch, or was he actually in?
I made that up out
Right,
of
that's
almost
fine.
whole cloth. He and Mickey Rooney and their third Jeep shows were 3 enlisted entertainers and a driver, going up to the front lines and doing small variety shows for combat soldiers who could not get any entertainment.
And do you know how far? I mean, because we're from a British sense, we're aware.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember from your school. Do you say you were in the UK in 1970s?
Yes.
There was a BBC comedy programme called It Ain't Half Hot Mum, which was a concert party in Burma or India during the war.
Yeah.
And that ran for certainly ran for 5 or 6 years, and I don't know, 30, 40. It's not shown in reruns because it's not quite the thing anymore.
Well, yeah.
Shouting at
It's
Indian
of its times.
shouting at Indian natives and making fun of people who may or may not be homosexual and the rest of it. But it, when you watched it as a child in the 1970s, but so I'm just using that as an example. And as you say, there's been a couple of British films about Ensign and such like, but they may have gone up to sort of company level positions. So you wouldn't be in the front line. So you would be the company headquarters perhaps. And if it was a quiet time, people would come back and be entertained, and more likely to be further back than that. So,
well, Enza did move closer. Some of them,
but the question
did get
is
close to the front line. Yeah.
The question is, Robert, how close to the front line did the Jeep show? Were they literally in the trenches, or foxholes as you would have it?
Yeah. They weren't jumping into foxholes during firefights and doing comedy routines, but the Jeep show in the book is indeed a realistic representation of where they did it. So there were by November, early December, American units were on the German border across from Luxembourg and Belgium.
Yeah,
literally a mile from the little stream that separated the two countries. The American forces were stretched very thin. As it happened, they were not expecting the Germans to mount a giant counterattack to the Ardennes in the winter. And there were company-sized units in small villages in Luxembourg and Belgium right along the border. So they are about a mile from the German lines, and that is where the Jeep show arrives, and they do their show for the soldiers right there. So it's about, they're not jumping into foxholes during combat, but the American Army will pull back combat infantry every once in a while for a hot meal, possibly a uniform exchange, about a mile back, still within artillery range, still within sniper
absolutely
range.
I was going to say that, and certainly dangerous. I mean, you wouldn't do it.
And the USO could not, the USO and the Red Cross could not go that far. And again, these entertainers were enlisted, so they were under orders. So if they were told, to go somewhere dangerous, they had no recourse but to follow their orders.
Well, it's an interesting thought. So, I mean, obviously, Jim, let's get your historical character. Jim
Tanzer
went through basic training. Do you know if Mickey Rooney and co went through basic training?
Yes, I do know that. They were at Camp Siebert in Alabama, which is where the Morale Corps soldiers were. Okay. Everyone went to basic in certain camps, but then you were assigned to your specialty and sent on to another camp, usually in the southern U.S. But so yes, Mickey Rooney, although he was a massive celebrity, he did not ask for and was not given special treatment as far as training camp and those kind of things. So yeah, that is real. Camp Siebert, and Camp Siebert was for the Morale Corps, and it was also for the Chemical Corps. So there was two different specialties going on there.
Okay. Do you know how the infantry or the armor GI, how did they treat them? How did they consider the Morale Corps? Do they think they were people avoiding combat, or were they?
No, they did not think that they were rear echelon garrison soldiers, which was sort of an insult to be called a garrison soldier. They very much appreciated it because when you're on the front, you can feel very isolated from everybody else, because there's a very large amount of geography where they're behind you, where there's not many people, and a lot of things don't make it to the front lines. A lot of the best gear, all the, plenty of ammunition and gasoline got to the front lines, but a lot of the best clothing, certainly food, other comforts, don't make it to the front lines. So when the frontline soldiers see these morale soldiers drive up in a Jeep, it's being physically present.
Yeah.
That makes a big difference. I actually read an interview with an ENSA entertainer, and it really struck me. And he talked about, he says, I did a 7-month tour of Africa in 42. I won't try to imitate his British accent. You saw me tonight. I'm not but a poor man's George Formby. By the way, no American reader knows who George Formby is.
I don't think anybody below the age of 50 in the UK would know who
when
George
I'm
Formby.
cleaning windows.
Right. Maybe I reached a little deep for that one. But he goes on. But imagine you're a 19-year-old Tommy from Lancashire, never been farther than Blackpool for a donkey ride. Him and his mates are guarding an oil field in Libya, 1,000 miles from home. Mail and rations delivered once a week, 120 degrees at noon, sand fleas, bath once a month. Can't even get Lord Haw Haw on the wireless. Well, you're chuffed to see anyone from England, aren't you? I'm no name, never will be, don't have the gifts. But the thing is, mate, morale is the showing up, the being there. Sure, the performance, but also the natter over tea and a biscuit, letting the lads know they're not forgotten. That I can do. And that really struck me. And I thought, in my own life and in all our lives, when we go through hard times, we don't really want our friends and family to be asking us all sorts of questions. And how do you feel? And, what are your plans now that you're widowed, or, now that you've lost your job? Or what we really want is our friends and family just to be present with us.
Yeah.
Just to sit with us and have a cup of coffee or smoke a cigarette. And that's what the frontline troops, whether they were British frontline with ENSA or American frontline with the Morale Corps, that's why they really respected these soldiers, because they were physically present.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the thing you always got to bear in mind about the Western Allies and the Second World War is that they were volunteers to one degree or another. Yes, many were conscripted or
right.
So I can't think what the American term for conscription is.
Drafted.
Drafted.
Yes.
But ultimately, you've drafted several million people. Those several million people could collectively choose not to do what you want to do or not do it very well.
Absolutely.
So morale, doing the laundry, clothing, entertainment, post mail, it all adds up. And unlike the Germans, who shot tens of thousands of their own soldiers for minor, infractions or mental health issues and all the rest of it. That wasn't a liberty. That happened in the First World War, but it didn't happen in the Second World War. That's not to say people for breaking, capital crimes, but not for morale type issues.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. The American Army was much larger than the American Navy, the Marines, or the Army Air Force. Much larger than those services combined. So the Army had to rely on the draft. The Navy and the Marines and the Army Air Corps kind of cherry-picked, as we say in America, kind of cherry-picked from volunteers. The Army had to rely on the draft. So the American Army, was the only institution in the war that represented the American people as a whole. So they drafted immigrants who could not speak English. They had to teach them English to understand their orders. They drafted PhDs. They drafted young men from poor areas like Appalachia. And my father told me there was a young man in his barracks who said his Army boots were the first pair of shoes he'd ever owned all by himself.
Cranky, yeah.
So the American Army was a very good representation of the country as a whole. And importantly, it was citizen soldiers.
Yeah.
They voted, they voted during the war, and their parents or their wives wrote their congressmen and complained about, whatever. They were citizen soldiers. They were ambivalent about their officers. They did not care for the hierarchy, which they called chicken shit, in the American Army. And what I found is that most of them said they were not fighting to save democracy or lofty ideals. They were really ended up fighting for each other, fighting for their buddies. And I found that often when these frontline soldiers were wounded, but not wounded severely enough to be sent to England or yet more sent back to the States, they would try very hard to get very quickly back to their unit. Part of that was, they identified with their buddies, felt they were needed. And part of that was also that you really didn't want to be a replacement in a unit where you weren't known, because until they got to know you, it was very dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just going to interrupt a little bit, and we're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors.
Feeling peckish? Tired of worrying about what you can eat? New from Otechno comes Ranko Muncho, the free from food. That's free from everything. Ranko Muncho is a revolutionary, guilt-free delight. The ingredients may include many legal taste enhancers, but best of all, it also contains Otechno's latest innovation. It's not mincemeat. Yes, it's not mincemeat. Absolutely no meat, no wheat, no dairy, no gluten, no sugar, and no calories. Perfect for anyone, whether you're a veggie, vegan, or anything intolerant. Go on, give it a try. It really is free from food. Ask any chemist. Perfect for Christmas. Ranko Muncho, the free from food. It's free from everything. Well, not the cost. Not available in shops, supermarkets, online, or any other outlet. Keep away from clothing.
Today's episode is sponsored by Otechno, helping yesterday, today. Otechno is a subsidiary of Uncle Schnookums Enterprises, wholly owned and operated by Deforest Co. Global, pioneers in transforming the world's rainforests into your favorite products. All rights reserved. No claims or returns will be honored.
And we're back. Do we want to talk about? I'm just noticing the time, Ian.
I'm conscious of that.
The trouble is, we could talk to you for ages, Robert. We really could.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
the battle. Do we want to talk about the battle?
Yeah.
Of the Bulge
So we've identified that your fictional equivalent Jim Tanzer. Jim Tanzer was in the Battle of Bulge, but the original Jim Hertzer wasn't. So, I mean, how much research did you do in the Battle of Bulge? Did you find anything interesting or unusual, or
did you watch the film?
The film.
Let's not know how good that is.
Crikey, the film.
Of course, I watched the film. I found it to be highly inaccurate, but it was about the Battle of the Bulge.
Well, it's mostly filmed in Spain and the Aberdeen testing grounds in Maryland, wasn't it? So
right.
So one minute it's snowy, the next minute it looks like a desert, but that's not worrying too much.
Exactly. And where they filmed it in Spain is brilliant tank country. The Ardennes are horrible tank country.
Yes, indeed.
Because, they're rolling hills and they're forests. They're actually tree farms. They're not forests, but they're tree farms.
Yeah.
So they're even more dense. And then you have to stick to the roads, and that makes it easier to defend. So yes, I did see that movie and saw some flaws in it.
It's like a lot of movies. I first saw the movie when I was a child, and I thought it was great. But but as you go, there's so many plot holes in it. You just think, oh dearie me.
Right.
But looking at the real, I mean, what's difficult to conceive of is in the real battle is the scale of it. I mean, it's hundreds of miles. Right. It's not. Right. A town here and a town there. It's dozens of towns. It's Luxembourg as well as Belgium, parts of France. It's huge, and the numbers involved are absolutely huge as well, aren't they? I mean,
there were three. The Germans attacked with three armies. Two were Panzer Army. One was an SS Panzer Army. They attacked off a front that was hundreds of miles, basically in the north, in the south, and in the middle. The three armies were dispersed that way. The army in the middle made significant progress for about 5 days. The army in the south, German army in the south, was really only there to cover the flank of the middle army. And the army in the north was heavily delayed by very tenacious American resistance on what's called the northern shoulder. And what the Americans were fighting for, what I learned in my research, the Americans were essentially sacrificing men and material to gain time. The German plan to get to Antwerp, to split the British and the American armies, get to Antwerp, sue for some kind of peace on the Western Front and then turn all their attention to the Soviets on the East. The plan was insane from the get-go. The top German generals tried to persuade Hitler away from the plan and to do, if they had to do some sort of attack in the West, a much more modest one. But Hitler was not to be deterred. So it was a huge battle. It definitely shortened the war because the Germans pulled so many men and material and armor from the East and redirected it to the West. So it probably shortened the war by a year because of the eventual failure of the Battle of the Bulge. I think one of the most interesting things that I found was in the famous, at least in America, legendary sea defense of Bastogne.
Yeah.
Everybody knows about the gallant 101st Airborne and the things they did.
Yeah, Band of Brothers, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Great miniseries. But nobody knows about Team Snafu. And Snafu is a U.S. Army anachronism. Let's see, slang, for situation normal, all fouled up. And Team Snafu was organized from surviving infantrymen from companies that had been overrun, but also rounding up radio operators and telephone operators and bandsmen and clerks, and in the case of the protagonist in Jeep Show, a morale soldier who happens to find himself in Bastogne. And this was turned into a combat unit, and Team Snafu was used to, among other things, to fill the gaps between the four regiments of the 101st Airborne. So that was a pleasant surprise for me. And of course, I threw my protagonist right into Team Snafu, and he does, even though he has not fired his rifle in anger since he left training camp, he does get involved with combat in the defense of Bastogne.
Yeah, your character. Sorry to interrupt. You're just going to say your character moves around, or he moves with Team Snafu, I guess, to sort of different scenarios, doesn't it? So, and those scenes read very true to me. How did you research those scenes in terms of where he's literally, he's in a half track or by a half track firing a 50 cal or whatever, or with somebody who's firing a 50 cal?
Covering his ears.
Yeah, and he's in the hospital later on with the medics and with no medicine and all the rest of it. How did you research those ones?
Well, I read a vast amount of nonfiction about the Battle of the Bulge and about the defense of Bastogne. I read many soldiers' letters from there. So those were all based on
primary source.
Primary sources again. Okay. Interestingly, I also followed when he is caught in a little village called Hosingen in Luxembourg when the Battle of the Bulge breaks out. His retreat day by day follows actual important battles of the Battle of the Bulge day by day. So he retreats to a small city called Clairvaux in Luxembourg that is overrun by the German forces as it was in the war. He retreats then to essentially a crossroads where the road west from Clairvaux meets the road to Bastogne. And there's been an American Army unit rush to that site to put up a roadblock against the oncoming Germans. And again, they're not going to prevail. They're just going to buy time. He then retreats to Longvilly. Longvilly is overrun as it was in the war. And then he retreats to Bastogne. So I was able to take this fictional character and have him follow the actual timetable and the actual geography of a lot of the events that were going on in the middle section of the battle.
Right.
Did you visit it? Did you get the chance to visit any of these?
I did. My oldest son and I flew into Amsterdam and drove down and toured the whole. I had his retreat in mind, the geography of his retreat. So we toured, we went to Hosingen and looked over walked down to the border with Germany. And then we went to Clairvaux, and then we went to Longvilly. So by the way, it was absolutely freezing. So that was a good dose of reality, as well as just how uncomfortable soldiers on both sides would have been with the weather.
Yeah, I mean, it's odd, that, isn't it? I often think, today, unsurprisingly, in the UK, it's raining, and I often think, if I were to dig a hole in my garden and sit in it for an interminable, for an unlimited period, and then have people trying to kill me, it's almost impossible to get your head around that, isn't it? How we've become, I mean, humankind's always been this, certainly in 21st century, so used to being inside with central heating, etc., etc. Proper rain gear. I mean, the American kit was probably better than the British kit in the wet, but it didn't keep you dry by any stretch of the imagination. Imagine being permanently wet, permanently cold, living in holes in the ground. I mean, I'm not saying that was the case for weeks on end, but certainly for days on end, it was the case. Occasionally, you get some respite, as we've talked about. It's an unbelievable experience, isn't it? It's just
sleeping outside. Sleeping outside in sub-freezing temperatures.
And when you add that, somebody's trying to kill you in the process.
Right. And they're also eating, in the American Army, they're eating K rations, which are, to the German soldiers and possibly even to the British soldiers, quite luxurious. But the American troops are sick of them by then. It helped. First of all, you don't have any choice. There you are. And secondly, it helps to be 21 years old. When I think of the things I could do when I was 21 versus when I was 41 or 61, so that helps some. But yes, the discomfort is the key word for any frontline combat of any, in any place, in any war.
Yeah. So let's just do a quick what if. I mean,
we may as well.
It's interesting. It's interesting, Robert, because you're obviously on top of your subjects, because you've more or less answered all the questions I was going to ask you. But
you've confounded him now.
Let's take a flight of fancy for a minute. Had the Germans punched their way through for however long to Antwerp? I mean, Antwerp had only just come back online, as we would call it these days. The port was unused, but it had been in use for about 3 or 4 weeks. They'd split the British and Canadians in the north and the Americans, and to a certain extent the French army, although the French army was very small at that point. But why did they think that would result in the Western Allies suing for peace? Yes, it would be a strategic blip or a tactical problem, but why would that? What on earth could possibly have said, "Oh, we'll just give up then"? Why did they? I mean, you've explained that most of the generals didn't think it was, but why did Hitler and his cronies think that could possibly work? Do you think?
Well, one thing is, Hitler, as we all know, was mad. And by this time in the war, he was a drug addict and mad. He also did not, because of the assassination attempts, I think 9 months or so earlier, he did not trust his regular generals. He did trust, his trust resided in the SS, who were fanatics, but not his regular generals. And I would guess he was also thinking back to his attack through the Ardennes and the overwhelming of the French army in 1940, which at the time nobody thought would. I mean, it was a bold and audacious gamble, and it succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. So he was probably hearkening back to that. A big difference is, well, two big differences. When they overwhelmed the Allies and the French, it was June. So it was summer. And secondly, the vast and vastly equipped American army did not have several million men in England, France, South, General Patton's Third Army was coming up from the South at that point. So it was a mad plan, but and by the way, the only area that they made progress was in the middle. Very able general named von Manteuffel was commanding there, not an SS. But they got within, sort of as they were sputtering out, the lead elements got within a mile or two of the Meuse River, a critical crossing. Well, who was waiting at the Meuse River but Monty's army? They, even if they'd gotten to the Meuse in force, which was not even halfway to Antwerp, they would have been in a tremendous fight with Monty's soldiers. So it really never had a chance. Let's say, though, that something the skies. And your listeners probably know, but the skies were very overcast for the first several days of the battle, which was crucial to the German success because the Allies had complete air superiority. So Allied fighter bombers would devastate truck convoys, armor. So let's say that it had remained overcast for a month, and there was some kind of, who knows, some kind of mutiny in the American army or something, very unusual. And Hitler had gotten to Antwerp. I think it would have been a big strategic setback. I don't think it would have changed the course of the war. By late 1944, the American Army was the only army that was actually growing in size and equipment. So there was plenty more men and equipment, on their way to the fight that could have been. So I think it would have delayed the war perhaps for a year and been, a strategic setback. But it was a mad plan from the get-go. But, Hitler, by that point, I'm sure he realized that he'd be hung. Whoever got him after they paraded him around would hang him. So what did he have to lose, in a way?
So what about the other, and it's just the one that I'm interested in as well. What happens if Hitler hadn't been that mad and decided not to do that? So there was a lot of equipment that was expended, to enable that battle.
Right. Yes.
So, and a lot of it was pulled from the Eastern Front. I don't know how much of that would have slowed down the Russians, advance on Berlin. Not much, probably.
Right.
And it wouldn't have made a huge difference to the Western Front either, I suspect. I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah.
If he hadn't been as nutty,
the end would have come. It might have been another 6 months. As you say, the, uncountable Russian army was on the move and would have been perhaps a little slower, but would have gotten to Berlin. And as I said, the American army was continuing to grow in size and equipment. So I think it was, but the Germans were excellent soldiers in the main, and their generals were excellent. And, defending is easier than attacking, as we can see in Ukraine right now. So it would have been more costly. As I think we were speculating before, the Germans might have experienced being dropped, getting an atomic bomb dropped on Berlin, because
we've got to get that in.
Yeah, there was no, even though there was in the American battles against the Japanese, there were some aspects of a race war to that. There would, by my reading, there would have been no hesitation if the bomb had been ready to drop it on the Germans first. The Japanese just were unlucky enough; they held out longer, so that the bomb was used literally as soon as it.
Yeah, I think Berlin and the German government were an ideal target because incredibly centralized.
Good point.
Everything ran through Berlin, both to a certain extent, certainly physically, and certainly from a government point of view, decapitation, and a certain extent where they had the excuse of the emperor in Japan, who you could make peace with because he, in theory, was separate from the government. There was no equivalent in Germany. You take the head off, that's the head gone.
Right.
So there was not a question of, if we kill him, who are we going to speak to? Well, you don't want to speak to anybody. You want to take the country over. So John, it's not just my getaway jail card every time we ever whatever about the Second World War.
It does feel like that it potentially stopped Berlin from being the first city being attacked with an atomic bomb.
Yeah, potentially.
I had not thought about it from that angle, but yes, I think you're right.
That's the thing with counterfactuals. You see, you start thinking, and then you think, oh, yeah, that's an interesting quirk. That who knows? It's So let's talk about the future then for Robert B. O'Connor. Where are you going next?
I have begun work on a sequel. My research starts with, as it did with this book, with a very famous series of American history books, the Oxford American History. I'm studying the period from 1946 through 1953, just understand the background of events. And again, research is fun and writing is hard. So, probably procrastinating on the writing. There were two things. One thing that went on after the war that involved my family and also changed American culture. And I'm very interested in writing about it fictionally. And that is what was called the GI Bill, the GI Bill of Rights. And basically, the GI Bill of Rights allowed returning veterans to buy a home or go to college on the government's cuff, as they used to say. And my father grew up blue collar, Irish Catholic background, probably never would have thought of going to college, probably, would have worked in the trades. He ended up going to Yale on the GI Bill. Now, he felt he was a little out of his element, but he managed to graduate nonetheless. The GI Bill sent, I don't know, several million GIs to university, and thus changed the fabric of America. My dad ended up being an accountant and having a white collar job, and then sending his children, making sure his children went to university. So I'm thinking of sending Jim Tanzer to Yale on the GI Bill.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, that was a very impressive post-war. I guess the equivalent in the UK, there was no direct equivalent, but as you may probably aware, we had a National Health Service set up.
Yes.
And that was part of the we didn't have elections during the war, but we had an election just at the end. It was during war because we were still fighting the Japanese, but after victory in Europe. And as you know, Churchill was booted out.
Right.
Mostly based on the promise of a social security based country, a national health service, free at the point of care, etc., etc. So that didn't give that individual education and right to soldiers, but it gave them a hope that there was a better world.
Yeah.
But the GI Bill was, I've read so many books of people, or obituaries, the obituaries unfortunately are all dying away because most of these veterans have gone, but certainly 10 years ago you would read obituaries and of famous people, and they'd come through the GI Bill, all sorts, physicists, all sorts of people. An amazing thing, really.
Interestingly, as I'm looking at the period 46 through 53, America experienced, the GI Bill, I think, was passed in late 44. But after the war, America experienced this resurgence of conservatism, and the New Deal was socialist, and the we had a massive multi-year Red Scare. So in a way,
and stuff,
yes, and it really damaged the country. And in a way, our two nations took opposite paths after the war in terms of the zeitgeist of popular opinion. So I'm also thinking about how to get perhaps Mike.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the drivers, because the American economy boomed, the British economy didn't boom. Britain had rationing until the night. My father can remember when when candies, as you'd call it, sweets as we call it, came off the ration. That was in 1950 something.
Yes.
We were still, but to a certain extent, that's because we were helping the Germans. But because they were, because we were sending.
They were starving. Yes.
But America was helping the Germans as well. But you weren't having rationing, as far as I know, until the 1950s. So it's interesting that a booming economy allows people to be. Look at life one way, whereas a less than booming economy
absolutely
points in a different direction, doesn't it?
It's the economy. It's always the boom, the American economic boom. People were worried that with 10 million soldiers coming home from the Pacific and Europe, that we'd get right back into the Depression.
Yeah.
And for the first year, that was kind of mixed up one way or the other, but then the incredible economic boom that lasted until 1982. You're right. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it greatly changes the mood of the population and the electorate. And so in America, in general, opinion kind of turned against the New Deal. And we missed the opportunity after the war to extend the progressive agenda to things like, for example, a national health service, which we sorely need in one way or another. So yes, the post-war period is very interesting, and I plan to write about it.
Okay,
Well,
good.
we look forward to that then. So
Thank you, John.
I enjoyed reading the Jeep Show. Certainly would recommend it.
Where can people get it, Robert?
Jeep Show is available on Amazon. Enter Jeep Show book in the Amazon search option, and it's available as a printed book, an audio book, and a ebook. By the way, if you write a book and you want to find all your typos in the book, listen while an actor reads your audiobook out loud, because I was sitting in the studio in Nashville, and about every third page he would stop and say, "Did you mean to repeat this word?" Or "What does this mean?" I was like, "Oh," and I would just circle it in red on my script and fix it later. And it's also available from bookshop.org, I think just in the States, for people that don't like Amazon.
Fair enough.
That's great.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thanks for that, Robert. It's been a really interesting podcast. We really enjoyed it. And hopefully we'll get a chance to speak to you again when the next book comes out.
I'll call you. Don't worry.
Yeah. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure.
So thanks everybody for listening, and look out for us on the next podcast. Bye for now.
Bye.